one of the biggest misconceptions about radiation is what has been seen in movies and on TV and in stories. People have seen through movies that when somebody's exposed to radiation, they either become a mutant, or they glow in the dark, or they turn into a superhero. Because of those perceptions, along with not having a lot of understanding about radiation, that leads to a lot of fear about radiation in the general public. They're worried that if they get exposed to too much radiation, or it comes from a weird source like a nuclear power plant in Japan, they're going to glow in the dark, or they're going to become mutants or something like that. We're exposed to radiation every day. We are exposed on an annual basis. Every year we're exposed to about 311 millirems of radiation just by being alive. That's natural background radiation. That radiation comes from things like radon, cosmic radiation, the Earth itself. Now, 311 millirems, to try to put that into perspective, is the equivalent to about 52 chest x-rays. If you get a two-view chest x-ray where they shoot a front and back and then from the side, that's equivalent to about 6 millirems. So 311 millirems is equivalent to about 52 chest x-rays. So we're exposed to radiation all the time. It's nothing that we can ever get away from, but it's always small amounts.
What are some of the common ways that we are exposed to that every day? For instance, food. There's a lot of food that I didn't realize contains small amounts of radioactive.
Right. There's trace amounts of radiation in our food just by the natural things that are in food. It's not like radiation's been added to it, or if the food's been irradiated, it's become radioactive. No, nothing like that. There are always small trace amounts of like radioactive potassium or radioactive sodium that we find in food. We also find small traces of those things, of radioactive elements, in our bodies. Very small amounts, but it's always there.
Does it hurt one person more than another? If you have a young child at home, are those small amounts going to be more destructive or riskier to that child than it is to an 80-year-old? Anyone more at risk than someone else to everyday exposure?
When it comes to everyday exposure, we're all sort of at the same risk because we all receive the same amount of radiation. So there's no one group or one particular person that's more at risk just by our background radiation that we receive.
Okay. And I know we had talked before, a lot of people are going out and buying potassium iodide pills. Mm-hmm. But I've heard that actually taking those, if you don't need it, is maybe riskier than not taking them. Mm-hmm. Talk about that a little bit.
So potassium iodide, when used in the setting of a release from a nuclear power plant, has a very specific indication. People think potassium iodide, it's one of these radiation cure-alls. If anything happens, it'll protect me. Potassium iodide is only indicated for protecting the thyroid gland from radioactive iodine. It doesn't handle or deal anything with all the other radioactive elements that come from a nuclear power plant release. It's just to protect against radioactive iodine. And the reason that we give it to people who may be exposed to radioactive iodine is because the radioactive iodine gets absorbed by the thyroid gland. Children who get radioactive iodine exposures, as what happened in Chernobyl back in 1986, they're more likely to develop thyroid cancer several years down the line. Older people who get exposed to radioactive iodine can wind up hypothyroid. The radiation can actually destroy or ablate the thyroid gland. We actually do that therapeutically. Some people who have hyperthyroid or certain hyperthyroid diseases, we therapeutically will give them radioactive iodine to help ablate the thyroid gland. So potassium iodide is indicated if people are going to be exposed to radioactive iodine, and it will be enough radioactive iodine to be able to potentially cause problems to the thyroid gland. So as already said, potentially causing thyroid cancer in children or hypothyroidism in adults. Now, if there's an indication for it, then definitely it should be taken. But if there's no indication for it, you can wind up having problems with it. Some people who have underlying thyroid disease who take potassium iodide can actually make their own thyroid disease worse. Some people are allergic to iodine, and so if you take iodine and you have an iodine allergy, you can wind up having an allergic reaction, which can be bad. So there are definite indications for using it, and definitely you don't want to use it if it's not indicated. Here in the United States, there's no indication with regard to what's happening in Japan. There's no indication whatsoever for anybody to need to be taking potassium iodide.
Have you been getting a lot of calls here at the Poison Center, or have you heard of other centers in the United States getting a lot of calls?
Yes, our Poison Center, we've received several calls about people concerned about potassium iodide, and needing to take it. Poison centers across the country have received a lot of calls, and they split up into two groups. People worrying, do I need to buy it, do I need to take it? But they've also received a fair number of calls for people who have taken it and developed adverse reactions to it. They've broken out in rashes, they've had hives, some people have had other bad reactions to potassium iodide and have wound up calling poison centers because of that.
What do you tell people then when they call in as far as how to protect themselves? Or do you just basically say at this point, calm their fears and there's nothing to worry about?
At this point, there's very little to worry about. The amount of radiation that's coming over to the States from Japan, from the nuclear power plant accidents in Japan, is minuscule amounts. The EPA has had for many years a system in place where they monitor radiation. It's called RadNet, and what they do is they monitor radiation in the air, in the rainwater, in our drinking water, and in our milk. They've been doing this for many, many years. So this is something that's been in place. It's not something new just because of what's happened in Japan. The amount of radiation that they've picked up on RadNet from what's happening in Japan is minuscule amounts. It's also far below any amount that they would need to take any action, or we need to take any action for. So the EPA has said, we are detecting small trace amounts, which was to be expected, detecting small trace amounts from what's coming from Japan, but it's nothing that needs any action to be done. So at this point, it's mainly just calming fears. We're not going to be getting huge quantities of radiation here in the United States from what happened in Japan. The area around the reactor, of course, is going to be a problem, and they've evacuated a 20-kilometer zone around the reactor because that's where you're going to see most of the radiation. The stuff that's traveling 5,000 or 10,000 miles away is going to be diluted down by by the rest of the air and the atmosphere, and so very little quantities have been coming here to the States.